Hey, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the Pillar 3 podcast. I'm your host, Philip Deng. Today, I wanted to go over what the state of the nonprofit sector is in terms of the impact of federal budget cuts. I'm sure all of you are aware of what's been going on in the government since the Trump administration has taken over and has control of Congress. And I wanted to give a little bit of an overview, a lay of the land, so to speak, and dive into some specifics. Let's start out. So the scale here. So a lot of folks are citing a $430 billion federal funding number that is at risk. And that number is basically showing how much funding has been frozen. $430 billion has been withheld or at least slowed down. So if you think about this, obviously some of it is going to probably end up getting through after the legal challenges work their way out. But just the delay, even, is really, really substantial. And the scale of that much funding not reaching places where people are depending upon it is really substantial. Just a few more top level numbers, and then we'll dive into some specifics. Recently, in July, Congress eliminated $1.1 billion for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's responsible for PBS and NPR funding. In April, 365 grants were terminated at the Department of Justice. So that's about $800 million worth of awards, which will no longer go to community violence prevention programs, all kinds of stuff. Again, more details in a moment. But AmeriCorps has lost nearly $400 million worth of grants. This happened in May to June, and 32,000 AmeriCorps members. These are, I did a program after college called World Teach. And so we went abroad and were teachers in different countries. And AmeriCorps, I've known a number of them. They are wonderful people that usually come out of college, undergrad, and feel motivated to serve in the American community. And so they go out into schools, all kinds of really, really difficult, challenging situations. They're paid very little, just a living stipend. And then they embed in communities, in organizations. And these are some of the most talented, smartest, dedicated people that are essentially donating their energies to be able to help communities around the country. So 32,000 of them have been eliminated. They no longer have the opportunity to do that. Also, about $12 billion have been cut from mental health and addiction services from the CDC and SAMHSA. Environmental justice, 400 grants totaling about $1.7 billion originally allocated from the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. And then from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, so far, 23,000 nonprofit sector jobs. They've documented 23,000 nonprofit sector jobs have been cut as a result of all of this disruption. And just to note that there's a headline just yesterday, I think, that the federal debt has hit $37 trillion, and the big, beautiful bill added more to that number, or will add more to that number over a 10-year period than at any other point in the country's history. So all these cuts have resulted in more debt. Just to say, not only are they targeted at some really important programs, but they're not saving us any money in the long run. If this were random budget cutting, you might see defense contractors getting hit as well. Agriculture subsidies still good. Corporate tax breaks and corporate tax rates were not impacted substantially. Tax cuts for high income Americans as well. There seems to be a pattern here. And so that's kind of what I wanted to dive in and take a look at today. Not saying that there is some kind of grand strategy, although maybe there's something getting close to that, but there's at least a pattern. There's something connecting all of these different areas that are getting hit with cuts. So let's dive in a bit. Let's walk through some of the specifics that I just mentioned. So we've got NPR and PBS, which from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which lost $1.1 billion. Um, the notes issued by them say that more than 1,500 locally owned public radio and TV stations across the country are going to be impacted. And just to put this out there, 96% of classical music radio programming is put on by these organizations. And maybe classical music's not your thing, but it's not a thing that was really costing the country in a way that we needed to cut this. Like the benefit of having that kind of music and culture available to anyone with a radio, that's such a wonderful thing, and now is being cut, without real justification, or without debate, without any sort of process. It and a lot of people who have come to take this service for granted, and to enjoy it as a station you can tune to on your radio, they may no longer have that. On a more serious note, emergency alert systems a lot of times operate through these same local public broadcasting networks. And so, as we saw with the devastating floods in Texas over this summer, a lot of remote and rural areas that don't have a ton of early warning or messaging infrastructure, they rely on this infrastructure. Rural communities are losing a source of local news. They're potentially losing a connection to different kinds of cultural experiences, and then also just practical infrastructure in terms of emergency alert systems. So this is a big deal. And so that's one example. Then we've got National CASA. So if those of you may or may not be familiar, that stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. So I had a friend back in Richmond, Virginia, Brian, who was a CASA advocate, and it was something he was so proud of. So he was paired with a few young people who had gotten in trouble with the law, and they were going through the justice system. And what CASA does is it pairs you up with a mentor, kind of like a big brothers, big sister type of thing, except this is specifically for people that are dealing with the justice system. So you can just imagine that maybe part of the reason why these kids ended up in this situation in the first place is because they were really kind of growing up on their own, maybe without strong role models, or just not a lot of guardrails on their lives, which a lot of us take for granted. And so somebody like Brian, who was personally deeply motivated to go and become a member of this organization to help youth, they have about $49 million worth of cuts hit the National CASA, the umbrella organization. And they are court appointed advocates for more than 100,000 children annually. They serve more than 100,000 children in the United States each year through 900 independent local programs like the one that Brian worked with in Richmond, Virginia. So these kids are losing a voice, a point of support in their lives when they're going through an extremely sensitive, extremely life altering process. And so the point of CASA is to help them make sure that they are showing up in those major decision points and conducting themselves in a way that helps them get out of this perpetual cycle of interaction with justice. So it's really, really sad. The number 100,000 children, it's hard for me to make that number real. It's so abstract to me. I mean, it's like two two big football stadiums worth of young people, their lives. I don't even know how to put it into my context, but it's a massive amount. And again, $50 million. There are NBA players making that in a single season, one person, one player. Nothing against, them making their money, but just to put that in the scale, right? So like this isn't a cost to the federal government that is going to matter to the financial health of the country. This is something you could easily argue that if you can redirect the lives of some of those 100,000 children in a more positive direction, that would have a massive downstream financial impact on our country. Number one, keeping them out of the justice system and being incarcerated, which is extremely expensive. And two, just being productive, happy, thriving people in our country, adding value to our societies. So just a really devastating hit. I already talked about AmeriCorps, so $400 million, 32,000 positions. So these folks are young people, again, some of the best and brightest students coming out of great undergraduate colleges and universities around the country. They go into schools, community health centers, they do disaster relief. So more than 1,000 program sites around the country were affected. So especially these are really disadvantaged communities trapped in persistent cycles of poverty, and they get this support. They get these really energetic, optimistic, smart people to come in and help jumpstart their different programs. I did something similar in my first job with World Teach. I was sent to the Republic of the Marshall Islands, really small country in the Pacific Ocean, but it was the same principle. I went out there, I had a living stipend of a few $100 a month, and I lived on a little island in the middle of the ocean, and I was there adding value as a teacher. These AmeriCorps volunteers, these AmeriCorps service members were really giving of themselves. And we've basically said, no, 32,000 really talented young people, we don't want you choosing to dedicate yourselves to community service for a number of years. I mean, again, $400 million. We're now talking about one NBA player's contract, maybe not for 1 year, but like 6 years, 7 years. That's the kind of scale that we're talking about again. So, a lot of money for you and me, not a lot of money for the US federal government. Okay. So this is just this is nuts. Again, 32,000 talented young people out in the community doing something really worthwhile with their time. Environmental justice grants. We've got 350 grants approximately that have been terminated. These are environmental justice grants specifically to help at risk communities to improve things like monitoring air quality in neighborhoods that are near different kinds of industrial plants that are prone to putting out pollutants. So, community air quality monitoring, lead poisoning prevention in children, solar energy installations in low income neighborhoods. And so, this is targeted to communities that are already experiencing really degraded environmental issues. And I've lived in some of these places, and I can tell you it's a big deal. It changes your behavior, whether you're going to go outside and be together with other people. If your outdoor space is somewhere unhealthy, then people don't go into that area, and then it becomes a space that isn't claimed by the community and can give rise to other kinds of activities that can become really problematic: drug dealing, violence, crime, that kind of stuff. If you think about a community trying to address something like lead in the water without some kind of assistance and some kind of financial support and expertise to come in from an agency like the EPA, how are you going to do that? This isn't something that you just get together and have a bake sale and then say, hey, we're going to get the lead out of our water. That's substantial infrastructure modifications that need to be made. So those problems are going to persist. And again, thinking about the future, if we have people with lead poisoning, poor air quality, those lead to adverse health outcomes that then become a weight on the community and on the country. So I just touched on this a little bit too. Violence prevention programs were cut. So again, community-based alternatives to policing. We hear a lot these days that police should not be asked to do mental health interventions. They should be there for truly policing matters, and they're increasingly being depended upon for things that they're not necessarily the most suited for. Teachers are kind of experiencing something similar in schools. And so now you have these programs that are trying to meet that need, that are trying to step in and help address things like gun violence, but we're cutting the funding for that. Substance abuse treatment, $11.4 billion were cut from substance abuse and mental health programs. At this time, when both sides of the aisle are crying out about the fentanyl crisis and overdose deaths, which were down last year, 2024. But I would predict that they're going to start going up again if we eliminate these kinds of programs that help people with addiction or to avoid these kind of substance abuse situations, mental health crises. It's just going to have that effect. If you pull $11 billion worth of effort and energy and expertise out of this critical issue that, we have close to 100,000 overdose deaths annually at this point, which is a staggering number. I mean, it's more than so many other forms of deaths of despair. So this is an epidemic right now, and people need to have the support and the resources to deal with this stuff. And we've cut that. So let me transition now. So what are we seeing? Okay, so one of the things that I want to call out here is that these services are not just going to disappear. They are going to be delivered instead by for profit entities. So, everything that we just talked about, these were all important services provided to our communities by nonprofit organizations for a purpose driven or mission driven reason. But there are for profit alternatives to all of them. And so let's just think, let's switch our brains from nonprofit mode to for-profit mode. So if you eliminate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or you drastically reduce the amount of NPR and PBS programming that's getting out into the world, if you make them less competitive, we've still got Netflix, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, or whatever it's called now. So, sure, you can find kids programming and stuff on YouTube, on Netflix, on Amazon Prime. But what's the difference? I mean, the difference is who is accountable. So, in the first instance, with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR, PBS, you have much more community accountability in terms of the journalism, in terms of the standards for what is the purpose of the information that they're sharing. So, if it's children's education, it stops there. They're creating programming for children's education. That's the point. Now, if you have educational content on a monetized platform like YouTube, okay, so if you're creating the children's educational content on YouTube, how are you making money? If you're that creator, you're probably making it by ad revenue. So now what you're trying to do, are you trying to educate the kids? Is that the mission? Or are you trying to make it so that the kids get addicted to the programming that you're watching? So I was just talking to some friends of ours who have a 1 year old, and they already said they tried out some of the YouTube programming for their son, but the images were so bright and so intense. They said even this 1 year old kid started to just become a zombie, and they got scared because he became transfixed. And was he learning? I mean, maybe. But what I think is happening there is that the incentive to make money, to incentivize shareholder value, it's really about making a product that sucks in attention so that there's advertising revenue, or whatever the revenue model is for these private entities. That becomes the purpose. It's not necessarily to educate kids anymore. It is to sell subscriptions or sell advertisements. So that's what you lose when you lose public funding for media, a public option. It's not like Netflix or Prime or any of those things are going away, but you now seed this whole area for them to come in and take that as well and turn it into profitable operations. So, next thing, child advocacy. So, we talked about CASA and people that sign up, like my friend Brian, volunteering, not getting paid, just because he felt personally called to the mission to show up for these kids. Instead of allowing that to happen, there are paid corporate advocacy services. Now, they will charge $200 to $300 an hour. And sometimes what they do is they pull it out of the estates of these people that they are supposed to be the guardians or custodians of. They have to get paid. I mean, I get it. That's fine. But it's transactional, I think is the main point here. It's not necessarily that the person is there because they feel compelled to help youth that are in trouble, and they're doing it for money. So instead of grant funding going to organizations like CASA, where they recruit and manage volunteers who are personally invested and feel called to the mission of supporting youth, you do have companies that will pay employees to go in and fulfill this obligation. But who would you rather have? If you put yourself in the shoes of one of these youth, would you rather have somebody there that's showing up because they're on the clock and they're getting, billing hours, and they're going to say whatever needs to be said, but Do they really care about your outcomes? I mean, they might even be incentivized. So the more that you get in trouble, potentially, the more they make. So again, the incentives for the people that were benefiting from the service totally change. Now it is a billable hours type of situation where you're taking child welfare and you're monetizing it. So these are really, really urgent situations. And we're basically saying, hey, what if we made money from this crisis? Let's talk about environmental monitoring. So these are the grants that would have gone from the EPA to different at-risk communities to do things like air and water quality monitoring. Once again, there is a private option. There are some massive infrastructure consulting companies. AECOM and Jacobs are two that I found that do really incredible work. They come in, they know about all kinds of infrastructure projects, water, energy, large scale. I mean, they're contracted for really huge projects, and they're really good, I'm sure. But what happens now is that communities that have this data would generate it and would have to pay consultants to tell them what it means. Whereas before, it was the cost of training and equipment. So it would have been something that was a public good. And now you're adding a little profit margin to that, to these massive, massive multi billion dollars a year annual revenue companies. You just lose that ability, that self-sufficiency, and now you have to pay for these big consultants for their reports. They own all the data and the processes and the analyses. And so my guess would be it won't make financial sense for these big companies to come in and do things for these small communities. Reentry programs. So this is for folks that were incarcerated and they're reintegrated into society. So these programs traditionally help with housing, job training, counseling. But again, there's a private reentry industry that is springing up. Folks like Geo Group they're a private prison company that's been in the news a lot because of how much they're benefiting from increased ICE detentions and creating all of these new prisons. So they have subsidiaries that are monetizing this practice. So you've got somebody that's incarcerated, they're trying to come back into society, and they just need the basics. And we had community violence intervention programs that were focused on healing trauma and building relationships. Again, you have people that care about that mission working in those organizations. They are losing their funding, and the groups that can step in are private security companies that will provide public safety. But what we're really talking about is something that they are not community and trust building focused. They are punishment, defense, and surveillance focused. And they're massive companies. Allied Universal is I think the largest private security company in the world. They have more than $300 billion in global market in 2024. Not a company that needed the revenue, but certainly one that will come in and take it. So that's kind of what I wanted to go over here. And a lot of people will say, okay, well, what about the benefits? So we hear a lot that the public sector and the nonprofit sector are really inefficient. And usually the standard that they use is to compare the private sector. They usually start out with something that says, we're going to come in and eliminate waste and fraud. And then what happens is they insert some middle layers, and those middle layers start to grow. The costs that they create there are generally pretty opaque. It creates a dependency on that. They grab the entire system. And then once they have that dependency, they raise costs. And the example I wanted to share is pharmacy benefit managers. Now, healthcare costs in the United States, especially prescription drug prices, you've probably heard how expensive they are. And one of the main drivers is because of pharmacy benefit managers. Originally, you had direct negotiations or much more direct negotiations. And then you had this layer that got inserted by healthcare companies, mainly for profit healthcare companies. And again, they said, we're going to make this more efficient. But then they create these layers of contractors and subcontractors and administrative fees, special algorithms for efficiency and scale. And then what happens is the costs just balloon. So the efficiency that was promised up front, a lot of times, if there's a profit motive, It's not necessarily that you have to be efficient. If it's profitable to be inefficient, it's going to be inefficient. You find that dependency that you can create, and then you have pricing power. And what happens is people will raise prices to raise profits. And so I'm very skeptical once we introduce a private sector for profit version of environmental monitoring or youth advocacy, that it's going to somehow be much better than what was happening before. It's all deemed to be waste and fraud. And eventually, if the pharmacy benefit manager model holds true, it will end up costing much more than it when it was under nonprofit management. So the good news, the pillar three theory is it's the other direction of this. If you can take nonprofit work and turn it into monetized for-profit work, I think you can take most for-profit work and operate it in a nonprofit model. That's literally that's the main pillar three concept that we're going to come back to again and again. Anything you can do for profit, almost anything, I would say you can also operate as a nonprofit. And that doesn't mean no money. It doesn't mean inefficiency. It just means that the goal of making enough money or surplus revenue is in service of the purpose. The purpose or the mission is paramount. The top thing is the purpose. And that's a subtle difference, but it makes so much real world impact. All right, so let's wrap things up today. The point of my discussion today really is to put these budget cuts into kind of an economic framing. These were all really, really valuable services that were being provided to people by mostly nonprofit organizations, and all of them were mission driven and working towards a purpose. Now, I want to say you can disagree with how these groups might be fulfilling their missions. There a lot of the criticism for public broadcasting and NPR over the years has come from the right and saying that these are too liberal. These institutions are teaching things that they disagree with. Now, that I think is a legitimate perspective to have, but the move there isn't just to cut it. The move is to participate, because these organizations were open for those people to also join and also have their perspectives incorporated into that programming. It's an ongoing message, and it's an ongoing cultural conversation that these organizations are cultivating. But the point of those of those media organizations was public benefit, was for purpose to educate kids, to provide cultural exposure, to do cool travel shows and things like that. And it wasn't for pure financial gain. It wasn't for shareholder value. And that's so important. And I feel really badly that the people that opposed the types of programming that they were providing chose to support their disbanding rather than participating in how you're going to shape those institutions so that maybe you can get on board. Whereas for most of the companies that are going to come in and fill that space, average people don't have a say in what Netflix is going to do as far as its programming is concerned. So on an individual level, I just feel like we're losing agency over some of these spaces. I think what I wanted to talk about today is how all of these purpose-driven, community-controlled service models are being replaced because of these budget cuts by extractive models, which I think is really, really troubling. My hopeful note that I want to end on is that it's not a one-directional thing. It actually proves the thesis in a way of Pillar 3, which is that there's really a very blurry line between for profit and for purpose operations. It's really just where you place profit in the order of priorities. If you place it at the top, then you tend to end up with really extractive models that kind of race to the bottom. And while they may provide some kind of consumer benefit at first, if they keep going, eventually it actually starts to hurt the consumer benefit. And we'll talk about that in future episodes. But if the purpose is the top priority, it just means that people have more opportunity to make choices. So if it's profit as the top priority, you have to do whatever is going to maximize profit, whatever is going to maximize shareholder value. If purpose is the top priority, then what you're obligated to do is serve the purpose. Sometimes that may mean making slightly less profit, having slightly less surplus at the end of the year, but enough. That's the difference. But you can make a decision. Human beings can come together and make a choice to do A instead of B. Whereas if you're in a profit motivated situation, maybe you can only choose A. So really it's about human choice. That's the message of today's podcast, is that these cuts to nonprofit organizations, to me, it's cutting human choice in our society. These are organizations that were working on behalf of people and places and communities because they chose to do it, not because there was a huge financial gain to be had in these places, but millions of people, whether they're AmeriCorps volunteers or environmental justice advocates or CASA advocates, all of these people were there because they felt called to do it. They felt a sense of purpose and duty and mission. And that's beyond valuation. It's certainly worth more than the amount that was cut from all of these different programs. And the fact that we are making it harder for Americans to express themselves when they feel called to do something like this in their community, the fact that we're eliminating their ability to express themselves in that way and contribute that value to their communities, that's the point. That's the point of these budget cuts. Choice is being eliminated in service of profit. Okay, thanks for listening to today's episode. Please check out my newsletter on Substack called Pillar 3. I said I would publish every other week, but I might be hitting a weekly trend. So please check out the newsletter this week. It was about kind of the history of the nonprofit designation, what those organizations are. So consider subscribing. It's free. Subscribe for free. Share, comment, do the thing. And then please keep subscribe to this podcast as well. I am going to be having guests in the future. I just wanted to kind of get the hang of this before subjecting someone else to it. But stay tuned to this. It's going to be, I guess, weekly too. So thank you again for sharing your time with me. I'm your host, Philip Deng. This is the Pillar 3 podcast, and I will see you for episode 3 next week.